I couldn't articulate why at the time when I was reading Wiesenthal. But on some level, I intuited that in the Holocaust, the leaders of our most advanced society made a very determined statement that human life has no inherent value whatsoever. And this, I will argue further on down the road, is the source of the special horror that the Holocaust inspires in us. In any case, I have spent a period of decades, broadening my knowledge of German history, of the German language, of the Holocaust, and about the end of the 1990s, I had a realization, which was that the historical profession, in fact, had already done a very good job of answering my question, how could this happen? Except that the answer that they've given us has been useless to us, because it has existed only in fragments. And what I mean by that is that academic historians like myself have uncovered each of the many causes of the Holocaust, about a dozen by my count. But by and large, in specialized studies, each examining sort of this or that causal factor in isolation from the others. And so we have books about anti-Semitism, books about racism, books about World War I, endless number of books about Adolf Hitler, books about 19th century German politics and why Germany did not become a democracy until 1918, and so on and so on and so on. And there's been no book that puts all of these fragments, these pieces of the puzzle together in a coherent whole, which is what you need as an answer to your question. Why? Your question, how could this happen? And if you're not an academically trained historian, that is to say, if you are normal, you have no idea where to begin putting all these fragments together. And that's what my book does for you. It takes all the major strands of explanation, all the major causes of the Holocaust, puts them together in a very concise, I like to think coherent, and certainly very accessible answer to the question you all have. So that being said, how could this happen? The Holocaust did happen in significant part because the pressure in Germany from the late 1880s on, the pressure from the German people to make this authoritarian monarchy into a parliamentary democracy, like on the French or English model, this pressure within Germany, which itself was a positive thing, came unfortunately entirely from one political party, or almost entirely one political party. And that was the Socialist Party. And this was a really very serious problem, because that meant that in the minds of most Germans, this wonderful idea of democracy that we accept without question was intimately associated in their minds, almost equated with socialism, which is something that they very much did not want, in particular because the German Socialist Party was the most dogmatically Marxist socialist party in Europe, and their political program and their stated rhetoric were very, very radical. They are calling for an end to private property. They are calling for an end to the capitalist system. They are calling for a revolution. And this is something of which all the Germans outside of the industrial working class, which is only 35% of the country, that's the socialist constituency, everyone else wants no truck with this at all. So the idea of democracy is burdened from the outset in the minds of Germans, and this has fateful consequences. This problem is magnified in its destructive impact by the fact that democracy came only very late to German soil. The first German democracy, which, as you know, was called the Weimar Republic, was established only in 1919. That is to say, several decades after democracy came to France, England, Holland, and so on, and almost a century after it came to our country. These two facts together, the linkage between socialism and democracy and the late arrival of democracy to German soil, have terrible consequences, because it means that the republic once founded, it is very difficult for a democratic republic to, whose governments are democratically elected, to function when the larger part of the electorate doesn't even accept democracy and votes for political parties that are anti-democratic and hostile to the republic. Secondly, The Republic, being founded only in 1919, was unfortunately also very close in time to 1929. And some of you may recognize that date. That's the beginning of the Great Depression. In other words, the Republic had no time to win over these hostile German voters to the idea of democracy. Any new form of government needs time to establish its legitimacy among the people that it governs, and the Weimar Republic never had this chance. And so, in the end game, which was the 6th of November 1932, the last free elections in Germany for a generation, the voters are absolutely desperate. Unemployment stands at 30%. And the bulk of the German voters have either never learned to accept democracy or have grown increasingly hostile to it as the government of the Weimar Republic is paralyzed, and so we should not be surprised at what happened. The majority of German voters cast their ballots for violently authoritarian political parties that were very extremist. On the left, the communists, and on the right, the Nazis. And this is not the whole story of how Adolf Hitler got into power, but it's a big part of it. And it also helps us understand why he would have had no chance in our country, even though the Great Depression hit us very, very hard as well. In our country, democracy had been fully established for a century before the Depression began. It was never in doubt in our country. And that's a big part of why, even though economic suffering is at comparable levels in America and Germany in 1932, we get FDR and we get Hitler. So the causes that I've sort of laid out for you so far of the Holocaust go a long way to explaining why the first German democracy, the Weimar Republic, collapsed in 1932. The voters don't accept democracy, and the Great Depression causes this terrible economic chaos and makes the voters desperate. So you can say that Germany was ripe for dictatorship in 1932, and yet why this dictator? Why Hitler? And why was anti-Semitism so central to his program? And to answer this second set of questions, we come back again to what I was talking before about this rapid growth of this socialist party that is so frightening to Germans outside the working class, and especially to the ruling class of German society and to the imperial government. And what they do, the rulers of German society pursue a strategy of trying to contain socialism by fostering anti-Semitism and sort of hyper-patriotism, sort of militant nationalism. They're basically saying, trying to get Germans to overlook their class differences or other differences that divide them from each other by saying to them, let us emphasize what we have in common, which is our German blood, which is now defined in part by excluding Jews, who by any criterion, German Jews are clearly Germans, but now are defined as a separate race, biologically distinct. They have a different kind of blood. There is Jewish blood and there is German blood. And we Germans must pull together because we have this common blood. To put it another way, this is a strategy on the part of Germany's rulers of saying to Germans who are in these different social classes, please, let us not be upper class, and let us not think of ourselves as middle class. And for heaven's sakes, let us not be working class and vote for these terrible socialists and their Marxist theory of class against class, or class struggle. Let us all be German together with our German blood, and let us unite against our enemies. Abroad, France, England, Russia, now painted as relentlessly hostile to Germany, which they're not. And at home, German Jews, who are said to be responsible for these divisions in German society. And central to that argument, that part of this upper class, this sort of ruling class strategy for uniting Germans against enemies, is the false claim, which we heard also in this country as well and in other countries, that the Jews were responsible for Marxism, that they had created the socialist parties of Europe, including in Germany, that they were in control of the socialist parties. And after the Russian Revolution of 1917, this accusation continues, but becomes more radical and violent, because they are now also blamed for the communist parties, which themselves are violent, more radical, and more greatly feared. And that ratchets up anti-Semitism further in the 1920s and 1930s. I want to emphasize this. I can't emphasize this enough. There's, in the first 4 decades of the 20th century, there are many different kinds of anti-Semitism in Europe and in Germany. There's, as a religious prejudice, hostility to Jews as perceived economic competitors. Anti-Semitism is a form of social snobbery. But it is this strand of anti-Semitism, the equation of Jews and Marxism, that leads explicitly and directly to the Holocaust. You can draw a straight line from conservative German politics in the 1890s down to the beginning of the genocide in 1941. This is one of the things that Hitler and his accomplices were talking about in justifying what they were doing. The Jews were responsible for the communist threat. So let me just sum up what I've been saying. I've been trying to explain what I'm doing in the last 10 minutes, about 8 minutes, is explaining where Nazism came from. And what I'm saying is that this strategy on the part of Germany's ruling class to contain socialism by uniting Germans against so-called enemies, to get them to forget their class differences, that this strategy paves the way for Nazism, because Nazism at its core is just a more radical version of this fantasy that if Germans can just exclude Jews and crush Marxism, they can all live together in complete harmony as sort of one big happy family. This is also, this conservative politics, this sort of right-wing nationalist anti-Semitic politics, is almost certainly where Adolf Hitler got his ideas about the Jewish people and about many other things as well. So let me stop again for a second time and take stock of the argument. The causes that I have presented to you so far help basically go a long way to explaining where Hitler, his ideas, and his Nazi movement came from, and on the other hand, why the Weimar Republic collapsed at the beginning of the 1930s, giving him his political opening and allowing him to take power. So we've arrived at 1933. Adolf Hitler is now Chancellor of Germany and beginning to consolidate his dictatorship. The cruel persecution, the discrimination and abuse of German Jews has begun. And yet these causes, these factors, this whole development that I've told you about, it explains persecution. It does not add up to genocide. It's just not enough to explain murder. It does explain how government could get into place and enough of the elite of German society would be willing to support that government as it discriminated against their Jewish neighbors and co-workers in the ways that they did. But to understand how we got from persecution in 1933 to genocide in 1941, there are four sort of additional radicalizing factors that stand out that help to explain sort of how you can get from discrimination to genocide. The first is that in that day and age, racism was fully respectable intellectually. It was seen as very hard science. And it was thought by educated people throughout the Western world, very much here, and here it was basically the thinking behind our immigration law in 1924, that each nationality, each ethnic group was a separate race, and that each race had its distinct genetic profile and its own inborn characteristics, and was worth more than some races and worth less than others. And this made it possible to define the Jewish people as almost a separate species, and thereby to rob them of their humanity, which made it easier to kill them. Reinforcing the dehumanization of the Jewish people through biological racism was the slaughter of 10 million young men in pointless fighting in the First World War. This devalued all human life in the minds of the generation. It set a precedent for unimaginable violence. The kind of violence that we see in the Holocaust against civilians is something that in 1914, on the eve of World War I, would have been surely unimaginable. But after those 10 million men had died, including 2 million Germans, for many Germans who lived through it, particularly some who had seen the fighting like Adolf Hitler, killing millions of civilians for a political theory, that was unremarkable. It was just one of the facts of life. A third radicalizing factor, one that is very hard for us to kind of think our way back into, is the deification of Adolf Hitler by the German people. We've all seen the newsreel footage. You've all seen this. The town squares filled with thousands of people screaming you know, with their right arms raised in the Heil Hitler salute, just worshiping this man whom we know to be a monster. And the belief, the widespread belief among the German people that Adolf Hitler was a genius, an infallible genius of superhuman abilities. This was a very widespread belief among people who were already his followers in the Nazi Party, and in particular in the SS, which organized the actual murders. This inspired a loyalty that led them to happily do anything that he wanted, anything that he asked. And among a much larger number of Germans, this belief in Hitler's magical qualities had to have gone some way to neutralize whatever misgivings they might have felt about some of his more radical policies. So, where did it come from? We find it baffling. It actually is not really that difficult to explain. Hitler was worshipped by his people because he was fabulously successful. You know, when he came to power in 1933, the country was absolutely on the ropes. And within a few short years, he had a series of dramatic successes, and he appeared to be the savior of the country. And I want to just give you two examples of Adolf Hitler's successes, the two examples that were most important to the German people and that fostered this set of exaggerated beliefs about his abilities. The first is that he comes to power in January of 1933. Unemployment stands at 30%. 1937, Germany has returned to full employment. Here in this country, we did not climb out of double-digit unemployment until 1941, when war production kicked us out of the Great Depression finally. The second great success of Hitler's, in the spring of 1940, German forces invade Western Europe. They drive the British armies clear off the continent of Europe in the Dunkirk boat lift. They conquer France. They do this in only 6 weeks of fighting, and at the cost of only 30,000 German soldiers killed. And you've got to compare this, as any German at that time would have done, to their experience in the First World War. In the First World War, they fought the same enemies for 4 years. They lost 2 million of their young men, and they lost the war. And I submit to you that, measured against this yardstick, a success like this would make a man like Hitler appear, not just to Germans, but to the members of any people, of any nation, would make him appear as a miracle worker, as indeed it did. And that's one of the things that made it possible for him to pursue such radical policies, including the extermination of the Jewish people. And the final radicalizing factor is the Second World War that Hitler started. This is a war in which 30 million people lost their lives, and this created a violent context, a context of such massive violence that it radicalized the German government's policy toward the Jewish people. And the Holocaust happened for a number of other reasons as well. One of the things that's been so fascinating about it is the complexity of the causation. I talk about those factors in my book as well, but what I presented to you so far is really the core of my argument. Now, I want to return now to the question I posed at the beginning, which is, what does this terrible history say about us? I've tried to spell out, the causes of the Holocaust. I guess the first point I would make is that, as you've noticed, the causation is really quite complex. There are a lot of different moving parts. And the main point that I want to make about how the Holocaust came to happen, is that this is not something that happened easily. For this catastrophe to take place in what was arguably the most advanced human society, it was not enough for one thing to go wrong, or two, or three, or a half dozen. By my count, the Holocaust had about a dozen causes. And of almost every single one of these causes, you could point to it and say, if this piece in the puzzle had been absent, if this factor had been missing, if this had not occurred, then we would have been spared this disaster, and we would never have to have known about it, because it would not have happened. And so I guess the first sort of point that I want to make to you in answering the question I posed at the beginning is that the Holocaust obviously was possible. We know this because it happened, and it is therefore part of our human potential and something that is always out there as a warning to us, and yet it is also very much not an event that was the logical or natural outgrowth of the course of German history or of European history or of human history in the 20th century. It was, in my view, about as improbable as a major historical event can be, and nonetheless still happened. It's always risky to draw overly broad conclusions about human behavior from a single historical event, no matter how important it is. It's especially risky to do so with respect to this event that is so completely and thoroughly exceptional. And this is not to say that the Holocaust does not teach us some important lessons about human behavior. It does, and I'll come back to those in the conclusion. So now I want to take 6 minutes and address the question, could this happen again? By which I don't mean, could genocide happen somewhere on the face of the earth, because as you know it has. But could it? It's not really the question that we're asking when we ask that question. What we want to know is, could this happen here? Could this happen in Germany? And my answer to that question is a firm and confident no. And I will give you 3 reasons why I do not think that that is possible in a society like ours. First, I'm talking of the world's established democracies. Democracies do not commit genocide. It is dictatorships that commit genocide. As you know from the history of our country, we have been able to find a majority of voters to support really cruel discrimination, such as against African Americans. But to get a majority of voters for mass murder on a large scale, I don't think that's possible. I just don't see how it is. The second factor and sort of thing that's changed between now and 80 years ago is that anti-Semitism and racism have lost their respectability and their legitimacy in political discourse. And by this I don't mean at all to suggest that there is not an enormous amount of anti-Semitism and racism in the world today. There is indeed, and frankly, an awful lot in our country. There was actually a very alarming survey that was conducted by the Anti-Defamation League in 2013, 2014, that showed levels of anti-Semitism in our country that I would scarcely have thought possible. However, having said that, I insist that the difference to 80 years ago is absolutely crucial. Today, for the most part, in most of the world's advanced democracies, in the workplace, in universities, in political life, you cannot openly and explicitly make racist and anti-Semitic statements. There is coded language that takes place, and that is a problem. But it is just so much more difficult than it was 80 years ago to organize a political movement, a political party, a political program around this kind of bigotry. And that is, I think, the second reason why it is difficult to imagine genocide in one of these societies. And the third and probably most important reason why I do not see genocide happening in a society like ours or a society like Germany is that all of these countries, we've lost our taste for major warfare, by which I mean war on the scale of the Second World War. It's true that we in this country have done quite a bit of fighting in the last 25 years, but it is one thing to invade a third world country like Iraq and lose 4,500 of your people, which is very significant, but it is quite another to fight a war on the scale of the Second World War, where we lost 407,000 of our service people. And if you scale that up to today's population of the United States, we were talking about a war in which we would lose 1.1 million or more of our soldiers killed outright, not to speak of all the wounded. We're not going to take those casualties anymore. I don't know exactly why, but we're not the same country. We're not going to willingly fight a war where we are losing people on that scale. The only way that it could happen is if we are invaded. And that's a geographic impossibility. And this is so crucial. The fact that we are not, and as for the Germans and the Japanese, the aggressors of the last major war, those people are pacifists today. Military institutions have no prestige whatsoever in those societies. So this is so crucial because you probably cannot have genocide in the modern age without a major war as the context, because war creates this violent context that devalues human life, and you were losing large numbers of your own people on the field of battle, it becomes so much more easy to conceive of, to rationalize taking the lives of some group of civilians that you perceive as a threat. War creates a kind of polarized worldview, a sort of polarized atmosphere that divides the world into friends and enemies. And people feel very vulnerable and very threatened. A group that can be defined as an enemy group, it's a dangerous group, can very easily be persecuted, as for example happened to Japanese Americans in our country during World War II, that we put in concentration camps. That's something we never could have done in peacetime, only in wartime. War is also essential for making a genocide happen because governments become so much more powerful. People rally around the flag in wartime. You criticize your government in wartime, you are almost automatically unpatriotic, and you're in such a weaker position. So for this reason alone, because a major war is not in the future of the world's democracies, for that reason alone, putting out of the picture the first two that I mentioned, for that reason alone, I think it is just inconceivable that any of these societies could perpetrate a genocide. And to people living in sub-Saharan Africa or parts of South Asia, or perhaps parts of the Middle East where genocide may well be part of their future, I suppose this is cold comfort. But we in the world's democracies are safe from it, and that is moral progress. So that's the second part of my argument. And yet, for all that I've said, I can talk to you all day long and make sort of reasoned arguments about why we should look at the Holocaust and, despite being horrified, nonetheless not be pessimistic. Nonetheless, all of us, you and I, when we look at the Holocaust, whatever's in our heads, in our hearts, there's fear. The Holocaust frightens people. And so I want to devote the last 12 minutes of my initial presentation to you to trying to explain why that is. I want to tell you a story. This is an incident that took place in Treblinka. We know about it from interviews conducted by the journalist Guido Sereni in 1971 with a man named Franz Stangl. Stangl had been the commandant, the commanding officer, at two death camps in German-occupied Poland, first at Sobibor and then at Treblinka. And when Sereni asked him, had there been any aspect of his time in the camps that he had found enjoyable, he said with emphasis, "That's what I enjoy, human relations." Not with his colleagues, not with other SS men, with Jewish prisoners. And at several points in the interview, he claimed to have had quite friendly relations with the Jewish prisoners in these death camps. And you've got to remember that he is talking about a floating population in each camp of a few hundred prisoners, mostly men, who are allowed to live in the camps only so long as they can serve their German masters as slave labor to keep the machinery of death running. I mean, some of these are the men who have the terrible duty of removing dead bodies of murder victims from the gas chambers to take them where they are going to be burned. And as soon as they have outlived their usefulness to the Germans, their lives are over. And they understand this terrible reality every bit as well as Stangl does, and yet his relations with them are termed quite friendly. His principal example of his enjoyable human relations with prisoners in death camps concerned a man named Blau in Treblinka. One day, Blau came to Stangl's office, stood to attention, requested permission to speak. He looked very, very worried. It turned out that Blau's father, an 80-year-old man, had just come in from Vienna on a cattle car, and he was going to die in the gas chambers of Treblinka within the hour. Stangl said, "Really, Blau, you must understand, it's quite impossible. A man at 80. By which Stangl meant that since Blau's father was too old to be that useful as slave labor, Stangl could find no excuse to postpone his death. And the younger Blau indicated that he understood this reality, but did not want his father to meet his end in a gas chamber. And so with Stangl's permission, he took his father to the camp kitchen, he served him a meal, and then he escorted him to the door, the entrance to the so-called infirmary, which is a structure disguised as a medical facility by a large red cross painted on the side. There the men said their goodbyes. We don't know what passed between father and son. We don't know if the son told his father what was coming next. But judging from the choices made by other prisoners in similar situations, encountering neighbors, friends, relatives in the camps, I think the odds are pretty good that he did not tell his father what was happening. And so as he was escorted down a long corridor deep into the center of the infirmary by one of the camp's Jewish prisoners who had this duty, Mr. Blau may not have sensed that anything was amiss, but when he rounded a corner at the end of the corridor, he immediately saw his fate. His nostrils were assaulted by the stench of rotting bodies. Before his eyes lay a pit filled with the corpses of murder victims. And standing at the edge of the pit, gun in hand, was a man in the black uniform of the SS. This man motioned the elderly gentleman forward, directed him to take off his clothes, had him stand on a wooden plank at the edge of the pit, and murdered him with a pistol shot to the back of the neck. Later that day, his son came back to Steinle's office. Herr Commandant, I want to thank you. I took my father to the kitchen. I gave him a meal. I took him to the infirmary. It's all over. Thank you very much. Well, Blau, there's no need to thank me. But of course, if you want to thank me, you may. What happened here? What does this mean, this interaction between two human beings? In Steinle's eyes, he had done Blau the favor of arranging for Blau's father to be murdered by gunshot instead of by poison gas. And this favor counted as one of the enjoyable human relations that Steinle had had with prisoners, in Treblinka and Sobibor. And his way of looking at the prisoners and his interactions with prisoners was emblematic, typical of many perpetrators of the Holocaust. They subscribed to, I referred earlier to biological racism and its role in the Holocaust. They subscribed to a belief system that held that the Jewish people were a separate subhuman species that was genetically hardwired to behave in a destructive manner, and consequently killing them was nothing about which one should feel not only no shame or guilt, but even unease, anxiety, discomfort of any kind. And they lived among their victims. They lived among people they had condemned to death, the way that Steinle lived side by side with Blau, sometimes for a period of years, and felt no apparent unease. Their attitude toward and this phenomenon of living with the victim side by side, living with people, all of whom you intend to murder, this is one of those things that are unique to the Holocaust, and I'll be getting to a few others in a moment. Their attitude toward their victims reminds us of nothing so much as that of a farmer among livestock, that he's destined for slaughter. He doesn't hate his cows. He doesn't hate his pigs. Killing them is just part of the job. And this way that one group of human beings came to see another very large group of human beings goes to the heart of what, in my view, of what is so horrifying about the Holocaust and why it is so important to us. The Holocaust marks a unique juncture in history at which the best educated and often most accomplished members of our most advanced society chose to make a statement that human life has absolutely no inherent value whatsoever. This is something of philosophical, existential importance, and you can best appreciate how important this is by asking yourself, why not? Why not commit murder? How do you know? And the emphasis is on certainty. No. How do you know that murder is wrong? I mean, to this question, you and I have the same answers. We believe that human life is precious. We believe that every individual has rights. We believe that our existence here on this planet has meaning and purpose, and value. And these are good and healthy beliefs. I support them, I endorse them. But they're just beliefs. These aren't facts that you can prove. The proposition that your life, or your life, or your life, or my life has some value just because we are human and alive is not a fact that you can prove. It is a postulate. It is an unsupported assertion. And you can choose to accept it, or you can choose to reject it. And this decision, this choice to embrace or to reject the inherent value of human life, this is maybe, you could argue this is the most important choice that any of us makes in our lives. And hardly any of us is ever aware of having made it, because it's made for us by the people around us, by the families into which we are born, by the society in which we live. It's an unstated choice. It's an assumed choice. It's a choice of which we have been happily innocent. Lucky us. And part of the horror of the Holocaust is that the perpetrators revealed to us the awful truth that this is a choice, that it is possible to choose otherwise than we have chosen on this important question. And they did this by themselves, choosing to deny that human life has any inherent value or meaning or purpose or significance. And they did this explicitly. They did this in the most uncompromising terms, and they did this on an absolutely massive scale. I'll make this concrete with examples. In the Holocaust, the killers denied the value of human life in words and actions that find no parallel in any other episode of genocide or atrocity. In the first place, the way, and you know this, you've read about this, that they reduced their victims to the status of material objects, which they processed as if they were animal carcasses, harvesting the teeth to melt out the gold fillings, using Jewish prisoners as laboratory animals in medical experiments. They sheared off women's hair for the purpose of making textiles. You don't see this anywhere, not Rwanda, not Cambodia, not the Armenians, nowhere. Secondly, you look at, say, the Armenian, Rwandan, or Cambodian genocides, the other three most important genocides of the 20th century, the victims were all killed for an immediate practical purpose. In all three cases, they were murdered to secure their killers a hold on political power. And their killers were not being entirely irrational in the sense that their hold on political power was shaky indeed. But there was no such concrete purpose for the Holocaust. I mean, yes, the Nazis came up with rationalizations about why this had to be done, but there was nothing immediate. There was nothing that could be defined as an immediate threat coming from the Jewish people. Not at all like, say, the Hutu felt actually immediately threatened by the Tutsi. It was rather that the very existence of the Jewish people was unacceptable to their killers. And so this is kind of in philosophical terms, a kind of different animal from other episodes of genocide. This is the only time in history we have come to murder millions of our fellow human beings for the sake of ending their lives. Which brings me to the third and final kind of unique aspect of the Holocaust that defines it. The Jewish people are the only large ethnic group to ever be targeted for complete biological extinction. The Nazis hoped to murder not only the 11 million Jews who by their calculations lived on the continent of Europe, but had they won the war in Europe, the next logical step would have been to try to use the resources, the enormous resources of the European continent, to build a war machine powerful enough to overcome us here in the United States. And had they been able to do so, there's no question, the next step would have been to strike at every single remaining Jewish population around the earth, no matter how small. If they'd heard that there was a village with 5 Jewish peasants in the southern tip of Patagonia, in the bottom of Latin America, they would have sent a death squad down there to kill them. They viewed the Jewish people the way that public health organizations used to view smallpox, as a virus. It has to be eradicated everywhere so that it can never, ever grow back. And so this is my argument about the uniqueness of the Holocaust and also about why we fear it so much. And it's also my explanation, I guess, to you of why I devoted so much of my life to trying to understand it. That the killers in the Holocaust have confronted us in a powerful way with the terrible question, does our life have any meaning, any significance, any value? Because they declare it so firmly, with such determination on such a massive scale that it does not. This, I think, is kind of a special horror of the Holocaust. And really among historical events, it is the historical event that, far more than any other, confronts us with questions of existential significance. It's in a class by itself. So I'm going to pause now for questions from you. I think we have exactly 30 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. It can be a question on the arguments I've presented or on any other aspect of the Holocaust that is of interest to you. I think the gentleman in the back has a question.
Yeah, until the WWII conference in '42, it seemed like the fate of the Jews was still up in the air. What flipped the switch?
Good. The gentleman refers to the WWII conference in Berlin, which took place 73 years ago today, and suggests that by then the fate of the Jews was sealed. Actually, the WWII conference was really not where the Holocaust was decided upon, but rather where the sub-cabinet level of all the bureaucracies was initiated into the policy by Reinhard Heydrich of the SS. But we don't know for sure when the decision was taken. The best reconstruction, the best argument I know, which is Christopher Browning's, is that Hitler made the decision in the middle of October of 1941, following about a month of exhilarating German military victories, and that essentially the mood in which he made, that this is something that to some degree he had wanted to do ever since he blamed Jews for Germany losing the First World War, which had been devastating to him as a French soldier, and that he made this decision in a mood of victory, euphoria, feeling that essentially his ultimate victory against both Jews and the Soviet Union was at hand, and that he was undertaking a bold new policy that was commensurate with his historical greatness. That's one reconstruction. The thing is, there's no paper trail about the decision to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Yes,
as a Holocaust scholar and someone who obviously has been studying German and the Holocaust is the theme of your adult life, what is your response to Holocaust deniers?
Oh gosh, I mean, you know, get professional help, I guess is the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, you know, what drives that? I have to assume that a lot of that is driven by an especially vicious form of anti-Semitism. There are, I mean, you know, it's what can I say about that? I mean, I think that it's part of it
seems to be on the rise.
That is my perception also, though I have not studied it, but Deborah Lipstadt is a very good historian, and I believe Emory University writes a lot about that, and she's probably the best source to go to about that. It really is, I mean, there is denial with regard to other episodes of genocide. For example, the Turkish government denies the Armenian genocide, but this is the only historical event that is subject to a worldwide effort of denial. I guess, you know, the most charitable thing I can say, not about the people who are active denialists, but about, say, not very well-informed young people who think that everything on the internet is gospel truth and don't know how to separate truth from false. I think that one other way of making sense of it, thank you, that one other way I think that makes sense of it is also that I think this is one event that we really would love to believe didn't happen. So I think that not everyone who reads Holocaust denial literature and perhaps is unsure what to think is not necessarily someone who is ill-intentioned. I guess I'd like to also think that one of the reasons that denial has been possible is that no one has really presented to the general public a very clear explanation that lays out all the factors that led to this. I like to think that's what my book does. And so I think that I like to think that if you have a clearer understanding of why it was possible, that makes it also more believable.
Thanks for turning. You asked me a question about the speakers. I'd say that's a good question. The kids had good speakers that picked up.
First is,
this is going to do that.
suppose, when you read Richard Evans' books on the history of Germany, what struck me was the description of all the oppression of different dissident groups before Hitler really got, at the beginning of his reign. And so it seems to me that it's not just an idealization of this great genius, but also that anyone who was opposed to him was eliminated very early, put in concentration camps, got rid of their jobs. They started with the socialists, then they went to the Catholics, and so that was the beginning of this framework. Then, and the second question I have is, when you think of the elimination of a people, because you can't just say it was of a political history, it's what's your feeling about Daniel Goldenhagen's book? That's really from bottoms up, that everyone has to be complicit in it for it to go forth.
Okay. The lady makes a couple of very good important points, with regard to, my explanation of how this myth developed of Hitler's infallibility and his magical qualities. I think she's quite right that the suppression of any kind of dissent very aggressively early in the regime obviously helps to maintain this immaculate image of the Fuhrer, because no one is criticizing and no one is contradicting him. So I think that's very correct. Now, the Goldhagen book, she's referring to Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, which was really a sensation in 1996 when it first came out. Goldhagen's argument is fairly straightforward. He basically argues that the Holocaust happened in Germany, you can say, for two reasons. One is that the Germans displayed a uniquely murderous kind of anti-Semitism, far worse than the anti-Semitism, far more murderous, violent, aggressive, hostile, than the anti-Semitism that could be found in any other European country, and therefore this is why the Holocaust happened in Germany and not, say, in France or England. And the second part of his argument was that pretty much the entire society, all of German society, subscribed to this so-called eliminationist anti-Semitism. Goldhagen's book has not worn well among academic historians. I mean, it's a very well-written book with a lot of passion. Its popularity is very understandable, but with regard to the uniqueness of German anti-Semitism, one of the problems is if you're going to make the claim that a country is unique in a particular way, then you definitely have to compare it with a bunch of other countries. In other words, you would have to, if German anti-Semitism is unique, well, okay, then what is anti-Semitism like in England, in France, in Poland, in Hungary, in Russia, and several other European countries, and then you can make an argument. Goldhagen didn't do that. He made almost no comparison at all. He just asserted the uniqueness of German anti-Semitism. And if he had taken the time to look at the history of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and on the territory of the Soviet Union, he would have seen that anti-Semitism was much more widespread, deeply entrenched, and violent. I mean, for example, just to give you one example, in Ukraine, in the Russian Civil War in 1919-1920, the Ukrainians murdered their Jewish neighbors, basically spontaneous pogroms by Ukrainians against their Jewish neighbors, took the lives of somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 Jewish citizens of Ukraine, 10% of the Jewish population. I mean, the number of Jewish citizens of Germany who were murdered in street violence during the Weimar Republic because they were Jewish, it couldn't have been more than 10 if it was even that many. This is not to say that German anti-Semitism was not, I argue in my book that particularly among the elite of German society, it's probably significantly worse than it was, say, in France or England or the United States. The other problem, the argument, his claim that this anti-Semitism is shared by everyone in German society, this is something that does not accord at all with the empirical record of what we know about anti-Semitism in Germany. With prevailing view among academic historians of Germany is that you had a core group in the tens of thousands of the most fanatical Nazi Party members who were committed to this ideology of the Jews being a separate race and being inherently destructive and being prepared at the outset for at least some level of violence toward them, and were very willing to follow Hitler into the most extreme policies. And and then much widely varying levels of prejudice among the rest of society, and the general, Goldhagen's argument, for example, about how Germans, his argument is that Germans all agreed with the persecution of their Jewish neighbors in the 30s, and all agreed with the Holocaust and wanted the Holocaust to happen in the 40s, but his evidence for that argument is simply that nobody protested, which is kind of problematic, given, as the lady pointed out earlier, if you protested, you tend to end up in a concentration camp or worse. A little bit of a problem there. What we do have with regard to the level of anti-Semitism in Germany in the 30s and 40s is that we have an enormous number of reports about public opinion that were gathered by the government trying to monitor the opinion of the German people in all kinds of different aspects. And one of the most striking aspects of these reports on public opinion is that the Jews are mentioned hardly at all. And so the conclusion that most historians have drawn from this is to say that most Germans embraced at least some degree of anti-Semitic prejudice, and also for the overwhelming majority of Germans, anti-Semitism was not an important political issue. And they were neither strongly in favor of the persecution of their Jewish neighbors, but they also didn't care. And so what I say in the conclusion to chapter 12, which is, as John was kind enough to mention in his introduction to me, which is about what the Jewish people knew when it was happening. I think that there was enough information about the Holocaust available that almost any German who wanted to think about could have known what was happening, but ultimately they did not even care enough to gossip about it. So indifference, an indifference very worthy of condemnation, but not the same thing as eager support for genocide. Yes, gentlemen.
The Frederick Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics that railed against central government, had it not had a chance to really get a foothold at this point?
I'm not quite sure I follow.
The Austrian economics...
You know about Hayek's argument to that particular...
Right, who was very strongly against centralized government.
That's right.
Coming out of Vienna in the 20s and 30s, had it not yet struck with the intelligentsia, why did that not prevent the type of response to Hitler and to his form of governing?
Well, I mean, there's sort of, I guess there are two things I could say. One is that Germany historically, from the 19th century on, that is with the Industrial Revolution in Germany, had been characterized really by a very high degree of state regulation and a partnership between government and industry. And altogether, you're talking about a very, Germany, I guess, was a society characterized by very big government already before Hitler came to power. And so Hayek's argument has played very well in our country, but I don't see how it could have gotten much chance there. And the other issue is that although most of the elite of German society, as I'm talking about corporate managers, the titled aristocracy, military officers, university-trained professionals like doctors and lawyers, and the higher civil service, this sort of upper 2 or 3% of German society, they had already been social. They weren't Nazis for the most part, because they considered Nazism kind of they had a sort of snobbery toward Nazism, which they perceived as kind of a crude lower middle class or working class phenomenon. However, they had educated themselves as part of the strategy I talked about for containing socialism from 1890 on by uniting Germans against Jews and against foreign countries. They had indoctrinated themselves with aggressive nationalism and anti-Semitism, and so even if they weren't exactly Nazis, they were sympathetic to Hitler in so many ways. And that's also a large part of explaining why all the people from these elites participated very easily, very readily, willingly in the Holocaust when it began, if that answers your question. question. The patient gentleman in the front row. And then I'll get to you, ma'am.
I find it very interesting that Germany's major ally, Japan, would not support Hitler's Holocaust views. In fact, the Japanese refused to turn over Jews that had come to China, to Japan, that escaped, and the Japanese would not get into this kind of situation. How do you explain that?
Oh gosh, you know, that's what we call a good question. That is, it's one that exposes the speaker's ignorance. So I can only sort of guess. I mean, it's an interesting question. Why would they care about these foreign nationals that were in Shanghai? Why would they hesitate to turn them over to the Germans? Maybe they understood enough about German racial theory to understand that they themselves were considered quite inferior on the scale. I mean, they weren't even white, so that put them like below Russians and so on, and that their alliance with the Nazis was a pact of convenience. But that's the closest I can come to a guess. I don't even have an educated guess on that.
Well, what I can think of is the Russo-Japanese War. If you recall, a man by the name of Jacob Schiff, who was a financier in New York in the early 20th century, latter part of the 19th century, helped to support the Japanese cause against the Soviets, and the Russo-Japanese War pretty much ended with a Japanese victory because of the armaments that were supplied because of the finances of the Jewish financier. And that may have played a role in this situation, you see.
Well, that is fascinating, and it's a better theory than I've got. And
The question I have piggybacks a little bit of what this gentleman was talking about, but what I have always wondered is, here it is, a man stands alone, you know, with an army. It's not a country that Germany at that time is overabundance of funds. You have all these countries around you. You even have the United States. What is it that he also had over all of these countries and the U.S. that we read about, knew about what was going on? How was he able to pull this all off without, I mean, thinking now in the days that we have now, you could not do this without people intervening and getting involved and not having it exist. What did he have over everyone?
You're talking about how Hitler was able to carry out the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
The monies, the fuel, the energy sources, the ammunition, the weapons, you know, not just convincing his German people that getting rid of the Jews would be the best, but you have neighboring countries all over the place. What did he have over everyone?
Well, what he had over everyone was that his armies were in occupation of the bulk of Europe. And that's really, and I mean, it's very often said that the world stood by as the Jews of Europe were murdered. And there's kind of a problem with that, in the sense that we, for example, were not standing by. We were arming to invade the European continent, but we couldn't get there. We weren't really fit to do it until we weren't equipped to do it until 1944. Likewise, the Russians were really on the ropes at the end of 1941, and it took them 3.5 years to fight their way back into Germany and to take Berlin. What Hitler had was he had the largest industrial economy in Central and Western Europe, plus increasingly large amounts of resources that he could plunder from the societies that he had conquered and occupied, and he had a certain amount of, he had quite a bit of luck militarily. His conquest of Western Europe in the spring of 1940 arguably was as much due to dumb luck on his part than to any skill on his part, and his rapid advance into the Soviet Union came in part because Stalin refused to listen to intelligence reports of an impending German invasion. But I've gone a little bit off track. I guess the main point that I wanted to make in response to your question, which is asked in a variety of different forms, is simply that Germany was militarily in possession of the European continent, and the only way to stop them from murdering people was literally to overrun the entire country. because they were determined to kill people all the way up to the end. Because murdering these victims, particularly their Jewish victims, was one of Hitler's highest priorities. Yes, the gentleman in the back there.
Professor Strauss, excuse me, of the University of Chicago, himself a fugitive, a refugee from Jewish refugee from Germany, was very, very cautious in terms of democracy. And here is why. He said the National Socialists were elected in January of 1933. They were the dominant party in 1933. In March, they elected Hitler to be the chancellor. And he said, however you dice it, this was a result of voting. And even today, what I'm saying is he was very, very cautious about the whole idea of democracy in general. That he said it has flaws. Is that true or false?
Well, as a general proposition, I mean, democracy, like any form of government, can have its vulnerabilities. The particular vulnerability of the Weimar Republic was that it had voters that did not accept democracy. So it's a democracy without democrats. That gave it its first vulnerability. The second vulnerability is the extraordinary circumstance of the Great Depression and the crisis in which that plunged the country. And the third, which I really didn't get into in my remarks, is that beginning in the summer of 1930, the Reich president, Paul von Hindenburg, deliberately pursued a policy of undermining parliamentary democracy in Germany. And this is essentially a conservative aristocrat, a general, took a series of steps that gave Hitler his opening and his opportunity to win the votes that he did. And the Nazis never got anything close to a majority in a free election. Their highest high watermark was 37% in July of 1932. So it's a partial answer. I think that gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I just have, I guess, a major point. Let's say in 43, 44, the Allies know the Jews are being killed in these concentration camps. Certainly by 44 or mid-44, there's no attempt to bomb these concentration camps. And there's no attempt to tell the German Nazis, you keep this up, you're going to get harsher penalties, because they knew they had lost the war. You keep this up with the Jews, as a warning, we're really going to sock it to you after the war. If you lighten up a little bit, we'll look at you differently. And just a question about the Japanese. The Japanese treated the Chinese the way the Nazis treated the Jews. I mean, in terms of their, you can argue that back and forth, but I don't think the argument was why did the Japanese.
Let me jump, because we're running low on time. So let me just jump to the question, just the two related issues. Why didn't we issue a warning to the Germans? Actually, our government already by late 1942 knew that the German government was engaged in a concerted plan to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. And there was an Allied declaration December 17, 1942, signed by the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and our country, declaring to the German people, your government is engaged in exterminating the Jews of Europe. This is a terrible crime. Any German found to be in any way complicit in this crime is going to be punished after the war. So there was a warning. Were we in a position to say we would hit you even harder with bombing? I don't know that it was possible to bomb them any harder than we were doing. We certainly were hitting their cities as hard as we possibly could, and we ended up killing 500,000 German civilians in the process. The bombing of the finally, and this is actually a topic that would have been taken up by Richard Breitman in his lecture here last May, I would imagine. It wasn't until the spring of 1944 that we even had airfields close enough to bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz or the camp itself. And it was in the spring of 1944 that the German government was deporting a total of 434,000 Hungarian Jews, of whom 420,000 went directly to Auschwitz, most of whom were murdered or arrived there. And it's interesting, the World Jewish Congress, I think, came to our government and requested a bombing of the railroad tracks or of the crematory of Auschwitz. And John McCloy in the War Department, who was sort of a reasonably high-ranking official, he just said, there's no military necessity here, and it was just not even taken seriously. And did anti-Semitism play a role in that sort of summary dismissal of that idea? I don't know. On the other hand, I also think that probably, even if we had attempted to, even if we had managed, and aerial bombardment was very inaccurate at that time, had managed to hit one or more of the crematoria of Auschwitz, and to slow down, to shrink the camp's capacity for murdering people with poison gas, as long as they were able to get their hands on those people in Hungary, if Auschwitz ceased to function, they would have just shot them by the railroad tracks somewhere. So I don't think that any lives actually could have been saved, but I think the fact that this was not taken more seriously and more seriously discussed in our government, I think, is also very disturbing. Yes, ma'am.
As an historian and as an educator, how do you think young people today, college-age students, should be taught the Holocaust? Because many of them don't know about it or know the true facts about it. And how do you teach not to be a bystander but to be an upstander?
Well, I think.
Repeat the question.
Okay. Well, she's asking me how should people be taught the Holocaust, and saying that young people are not really being taught it today. I think that it really has to be taught in schools, because I think in college people just take electives in college, and if they don't choose to take some history classes, they may never really learn too much about it. But she raises the particular sort of question: how do you teach people to be someone who would intervene as opposed to simply being a passive bystander? It's interesting. There are a lot of psychological experiments that are done about sort of how people react in certain situations when they see that. Do they call for help when someone needs help, or do they not call for help? And sort of in what circumstances do they do so? I actually don't have a very good handle on that literature, but that seems kind of relevant and interesting. Yes, Richard.
Yeah. How do you get the intelligentsia of the Germans to deny, they call it Jewish physics, so Einstein doesn't exist? They take music like Mendelssohn, he's the family part of a Jew, you deny that. 30% of all doctors in Berlin were Jewish, so you have medical staff denying this, saying that the Jewish medicine doesn't exist. How do you get those people? Your top professors also were leading Germans to destroy Jews. And then you have the major industrial factories that are coming out with the building of the crematoria. How do you get those people on that level to decide, okay, let's murder Jews?
Well, there's two answers, I think, to your question. One is that I think, again, the fact that the ruling class of German society, which included this intelligentsia, had been allied with a government that was using anti-Semitism as part of its strategy of containing socialism. In other words, they had been indoctrinating themselves in a pretty rabid form of anti-Semitism for decades, for 3 generations, starting in 1890. So there's that intellectual and political preparation. We tend to sort of think of today of racism or other ugly prejudices as being kind of the prejudices of people who are uneducated and who have been unsuccessful in life. I think it's quite possible that the people in German society who were most likely to be dangerously anti-Semitic were precisely the people at the top. And the other factor is, you kind of allude to this, how they proceed in the profession, like in the sciences, they try to purge physics of Jewish influence, or they try to. That was less successful, but for example, in the study of literature or German literature or in music, to sort of weed out all the Jewish references. And of course, also, they were all of these people were only too happy to be rid of their Jewish colleagues who were their competitors. This is particularly true in law and medicine. And they went through a process of forcing out their Jewish colleagues in all of these areas in which the intelligentsia of Germany were working. And in every time they agreed to this, to the forcing out of a capable colleague, a treasured colleague, a loyal colleague, forcing this person out and depriving them of their rights, they compromised themselves morally. They just sort of went further and further down a path of moral compromise. And one of the things about hard to demonstrate, but one of the things about compromising yourself morally in a particular direction is it becomes harder and harder to turn back. Because you get to the next immoral thing you're asked to do, and if you want to stand up and say, no, that's immoral, then you have to admit that everything you did up to that point in that direction was immoral. Like agreeing to let your Jewish colleague, be deprived of his pension and fired from his job. In other words, to get clean, you have to get dirtier first, and that's something that's very difficult for people to do. So anyway, I need to, I actually do need to, I need to come to a conclusion. So I became a historian in order to confront the existential implications of the Holocaust. That is, this determined statement by the leaders of one of our most advanced societies that human life, including mine, has no inherent value whatsoever. Millions of people have read books about the Holocaust, and hardly any of them have reacted quite as strongly to it as I have. And I've often wondered exactly why that was so, and what peculiarity in my character might have led me to be so committed to the study of this when others have only read about it. And I've never come up with a very persuasive answer, but one thing about my own upbringing and background that seems relevant is that I never had a religious education of any kind. I've never believed in God. I'm not an atheist, but I've never had any belief. And, if you have firm belief, the existential questions are manageable for you. Your life has value because you're made in the image of God. Your life has purpose because God put you here on the planet for a reason. If you're like me and you have no faith at all, you're not made in the image of God. You're just a glorified monkey. And you face these questions alone. And the only way of dealing with this kind of grim reality that I've ever found is to embrace an unconditional love for all human beings. To be able to say to myself, my life has value because I'm human and every human life has value. And I am deserving of love because every human being is lovable. And nothing challenges this philosophical position like the Holocaust. The Auschwitz survivor Elie Wiesel put it best. The opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is indifference. And you see this indifference in the way that Franz Stangl treated the Blau family in Treblinka. He didn't hate them. It meant so little to him, though, that murdering them was just a job. And when he arranged for Blau's father, a terrified 80-year-old man, to be murdered by gunshot in a humiliating manner by an SS man who would pit of bodies, but it was better than poison gas. And this didn't make, in Stangel's eyes, this didn't make him a murderer. It made him a nice guy. People ask me constantly, why did they hate the Jews so much? People assume, and this is the most natural, logical, reasonable thing to assume, they assume that the Holocaust was fueled by an especially passionate form of hatred. And to that I can only say we should be so lucky. We should be so lucky. Because hatred is a relationship between human beings who acknowledge each other's humanity. We care about people we hate. They're important to us. And yes, in the Holocaust, many of the murderers hated their Jewish victims. They, of course, were anti-Semites, but hatred, that was not the dominant motive. The signature mental state of the Holocaust perpetrator, arguably what makes the Holocaust, was not hot, passionate hatred, but rather an indifference so cold that mass murder provoked no emotion more powerful than the disgust you feel when you step on a cockroach in your kitchen. So if love for humanity is kind of my way of making sense of the world, I really need to make sense of the Holocaust, because this is the ultimate negation of any kind of love for anyone. And I had to know how this could happen. I had to understand what this says about us. Let me start with what it does not say. You know, the Holocaust does not demonstrate that we, the people in this room, are evil. By evil, I mean deliberately and happily doing what you know to be morally depraved. You know from your experience, there are very few people like that. In fact, most of us probably never in our whole lives meet someone quite like that. They're called sociopaths. Yes, you've encountered people who've hurt you. You've encountered people who've treated you in an unethical manner, who've robbed you, who cheated you in some way, or lied to you. But all of these people themselves need to go home and persuade themselves. They need to look in the mirror and tell themselves that they had good reasons for doing what they did, that what they did was morally justifiable. They need to rationalize. They, like us, like almost everyone, they like to think of themselves as morally upright, decent, and kind. And the murderers in the Holocaust were no different from us in this regard. The tricky part is how do we decide what's moral? That's not good. So, you know, the big problem, and I guess the worst thing that I learned about human beings in my studies is that we lack a moral compass. We just do not have an internal gyroscope that can keep us on the moral straight and narrow, no matter how our circumstances change, no matter what the people around us are doing. And when our circumstances change dramatically enough, we just rewrite our moral code. We redefine right and wrong to fit our circumstances, often in a matter of minutes. And so the Holocaust does show us that if you teach us the wrong ideas, and if you put us under the wrong government, and if you place us in the wrong circumstances, we are capable of doing absolutely anything, no matter how depraved. The Holocaust has demonstrated there is no level below which we cannot sink if the circumstances are bad enough. But the most important word in that sentence is if. And since the Second World War, we have been teaching ourselves the right ideas. We have been working to strengthen the right kind of government, democracy. And we've largely avoided the circumstances that foster cruelty. And in so doing, we have built human societies that are morally superior to everything that came before in all of human history. And this is moral progress. So in closing, there are just two things that I want for you, two things I want you to get from reading my book. First, I hope that, and I rather expect that by the time you finish reading it, you will feel that you understand how this could happen. That this will no longer be a terrible mystery. And second, I hope that you will come to see the Holocaust in what I believe is the proper perspective. Yes, as quite possibly the most depraved and horrible thing that we have ever done. And consequently, not only is something that we need to remember, but it's something that must be vivid in our memory, alive in our memory. But on the other hand, no, not as our destiny. And never as an excuse for pessimism about the future of humanity. I thank you very much for listening.